Now nobody's talking about it. To me, that upsets me. That like, it's just like, it's all crickets. Like, come on, guys, we have to talk about this. If we want genuine police reform, we have to talk about all these cases months after this all happened. And so then we can actually improve the police. We can actually get the reform that we all want, and me included.
Thank you for tuning in to the Removing Barriers podcast. I'm Jay.
And I'm MCG.
And we're attempting to remove barriers so we can all have a clear view of the cross.
This is episode 30 of the Removing Barriers podcast, and the fifth in the series of Black Lives Matter and its mission. The first in the series was episode 3, Black Lives Matter, an introduction to the movement. The second one, episode 4, Black Lives Matter, the destruction of the nuclear family. And the third was episode 8, Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQIA movement. And the fourth, episode 27, Black Lives Matter, the Marxist movement. Those episodes can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Riot Radio, and most places where podcasts can be found. In this episode, we will be looking at Black Lives Matter and the police. And we have Officer CigarBro as our guest. Officer CigarBro is a police officer in the United States, but his state, county/city will remain unknown for obvious reasons. Officer CigarBro, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Removing Barriers podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Officer CigarBro, why don't you introduce yourself to us and just tell us about, why did you become a police, your service, whatever you want to tell us that you want the folks to know about you.
Okay, certainly. So, I was a very new police officer, just about have a year on the street, 2 years total. Located on the East Coast, this is about as far as I'll go for where I'm located at. And I was in the military prior to that. I was in the Marine Corps for about 6 years in the reserves before I decided to become a police officer. And I decided to sign up for the police department primarily because where I used to live at, I thought that maybe they needed someone with help and stuff like that. And so I applied many other places throughout in my state. And then I decided to become a cop in the city and everything. So I thought I want to continue my service and stop. I thought I was done with the Marine Corps and everything. But other than that, I've always been like in this type of service kind of everything. I wanted to, for lack of a better term, try to hit the community, or not hit the community, but like serve the community from like a more where I used to live at and everything. So that's why I decided to become a police officer.
So I imagine that in deciding to serve the community, you were well aware of the danger that exists in serving in, like you said, you have a year of street experience. Do you ever worry about yourself when you leave your home? Do your loved ones worry about you when you put on your uniform and you go out and you do your job?
Yeah, I definitely do. I always think about that. It's always, how would I say? It's like your shadow. It's always there. And so you kind of like remind yourself. It reminds you that there is always this danger. Before I ever put the uniform on, where I officially got my badge and gun, that's what we call badge and gun, for a lack of a better phrase, when you do graduate the academy. Before I would leave the house. Well, like when I leave the house for work, then, of course I would say, bye to my fiance and my mom and my parents and everything. But now, every single time I go to work, before I go to work, I always say bye to them when applicable. I'm not going to wake them up at 5:30 in the morning. But before I go to work, I always try to say, hey, I'm heading to work, love you. I'm going down to where I work at. I always put that in mind. Unfortunately, there is always that chance where I might not come back home. But I try to do my best to prevent that from happening.
Right. Before we go any further, let me just say thank you for your service in the military.
Absolutely.
My wife, Jay, is being modest, but she's also a former Marine of 8 years. So,
so
she didn't mention that, but I'm going to mention it for her. So,
well, thank you for your service. I didn't know that. That's nice.
Yeah, definitely. And I can imagine because I delivered a pizza for about 6 months when I was trying to pay off my student loan. And they say delivering pizza is one of the most dangerous jobs in the U.S. But I can't imagine it's anything like putting on a badge and a uniform and going out there, especially in today's political climate.
Yeah.
So how dangerous is a police officer job, especially in the U.S. on a day-to-day basis, especially in today's culture?
Yeah, in today's culture, how would I say this? It levels, it's like I don't want to say it's like a horror movie, but you understand like the vibe. It's always kind of there. There's a certain tension. And sometimes the tension stays the same day. And for me, that's great. Sometimes you don't get anything crazy. Or sometimes you're just bored and you're just watching YouTube on your phone. You're just doing your business checks. You're just talking on people, do this, do that. Nothing bad. And that's a boring day is a good day for a police officer. That's probably one of the best days where you just sit in your car and do absolutely nothing. But other days where it can it can go from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And yeah, it can pick up and it can go crazy in like 1 hour. You have 1 hour of craziness, and then the rest of the day is all calm. And before you know it, you're dealing with like a homeless person's, sleeping on the bench, you just need him to move, or like it's just like, oh, somebody broke into my car, and your adrenaline is still kind of like trying to tamper off, for lack of a better word. So the thing is about like being a police officer is that it's so unpredictable, and it's so hard to try to calm down that adrenaline. And I think the Joe Rogan podcast had a psychologist who worked with law enforcement as well. Her name was Nancy Panza, I think it was.
Okay.
But anyway, if you look at just one of the simple highlights, it shows the emotional fitness and the psychological fitness that a police officer has to go through. Usually, if you go through a very critical incident, let's just say it's something like, to me, it's very benign, but say like a really terrible car accident where somebody has to go to the hospital. You got make sure she's okay. You got to get this thing towed. You got to go to the hospital, make sure that person's in good shape and she's going to be in good recovery. That height will go up. And then when you go home, that height is kind of there, and then you kind of go down.
There's a crash.
Yeah, the mood level goes down. You kind of want to be by yourself. You don't want to talk to anybody. You want to sit home, either watch TV or play video games, like I usually do that. And then, according to the psychologist, she said that it takes about 24 hours for that person to go back up to normal. But for us, we got to go back to work and do that 8-hour shift. And so it goes up and down. It consistently goes up and down. And that's probably, for me, that simple JRE clip completely opened my mind about how to be emotionally fit and how to make sure I don't turn into like those bad police officers that, I unfortunately have seen not only just in social media, and I'm not talking about like, we'll get into this eventually. I know we're going to get into this eventually with the questions you're going to give me, but I've seen like the police officers that become apathetic or they become a lack of empathy and stuff like that. And I don't want to turn into that. So they say that you usually don't want to do like overtime, or you want to keep your work and your personal life separate. So you can still do like your hobbies and not be affected by it. And so far, by the looks of it, I've done good, at least by my self-assessment. I've been doing a good job of keeping that separate, but I have to keep myself in check and all that.
Yeah, Officer CigarBro, go a little bit deeper. What do you do to maintain your mental health? I know you mentioned playing video games, keeping personal life and work like separate, but I imagine it's easier said than done. So what are some of the things you do just to maintain your mental health from 1 hour of your day where you had to maybe draw your gun, or as you said, maybe just a really bad accident you had to deal with or whatever? How do you go about helping your mental state? Go a little bit deeper on that.
Yeah, so for me, it's like just my hobbies, really. I go to like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym. That honestly, like it's kind of funny because like honestly fighting someone or trying not to get submitted in the gym is honestly one of the greatest stress relievers. And like hitting the bag or punching the bag, doing drills like that, not only is it like a great self-defense thing throughout the street, but it's also a great stress reliever. Also, just going like, I know you guys are a faith-based podcast. I go to like a Bible study. I listen to not just podcasts such as yours, but like also, more Bible related, like Bible focused podcasts and everything. And I'm trying to read trying to read more books like on how to become a better, person and all that kind of stuff. You don't want to not be completely blind to work or like living under a rock, for like a better phrase, from work. It's just that you have to set a boundary. Like a simple one for me is to not look at emails, not look at work emails, or not pick up my work phone unless I have to submit time. I was held over for like a robbery or something like that. I had to stay over for 3 hours. I had to submit the overtime on the work phone or on my computer. But other than that, I do not touch that work phone. I don't touch the work phone. I do any of that. So that's just how I do it. It depends on person to person, though.
I know that we've covered this point quite a bit in this part of the podcast, but I'd like to add my 2 cents. I remember watching a video on YouTube of a man who was on some type of, he was affected by something, some drug, no one knows what it was exactly. And he was in a fight with his fiance, lover, girlfriend, whatever she was. He took their 1-year-old baby from her and ran away. When he was confronted by the police, he used that baby as a human shield when it came to the police. And what the police had to do, unfortunately, was to take him out, because while he was holding that baby, he was shooting at the officers. So one officer pulled up, took out his rifle, shot him, and the other officer ran and grabbed the baby. And in the span of 7 minutes, even less than that, the officers had to flip the switch and go from being able to zero in on a rifle to take someone out, take the guy out, and then flip that switch off to go and get the baby and provide comfort and provide whatever that baby needed at the moment that his father was shot. And I was taken aback by that, because every officer, like you were talking about how you have to go from 0 to 100. It could be boring, and in the next 30 minutes it's on. And that back and forth between intensity and quiet, it can really wreak havoc, I would imagine, mentally. And so I think that perhaps we as civilians, when it comes to interacting with the police, we need to keep that in mind. Police officers are human beings too. And we're asking them, we're paying them, we've appointed them to do a very difficult job. And we need to be mindful of that. And perhaps the sentiment shouldn't necessarily be antagonistic toward police, but more conciliatory and seeking to find how we can mutually help one another. And I just wanted to throw that out there, because I think you brought up a great point about the mental strain that exists on our police officers. And in today's climate, particularly, let's say, for example, last summer, when we had a lot of riots going on, crowds, protests, and all these different things that police officers were called to, I imagine that's hyped up even 10 times more, because you've got a limited number of police officers and there's this gigantic mob and they're all angry at the police officers, and they have to do crowd control and they have to be careful not to use too much force but then knowing how to balance and use enough force. So could you tell us, in your experience, if you have any, about what it's like to do crowd control, particularly now that the crowds are antagonistic toward you? Is it something where you're just constantly at a heightened level of reactionary feelings, or what is it like doing crowd control, particularly in today's climate?
So for me, in my personal experience, luckily our city didn't have any massive riots. We actually lucked out very hard, and our lessons were learned 5 years ago when we had the last couple of riots 5 years ago in 2015, 2016. But we are trained necessarily for, if you do have a crowd and if it is peaceful, you wouldn't really have, for us at least, we wouldn't have our riot gear. We would have like our gas masks in case it did escalate to that degree, in case we needed to release tear gas, then we have our gas masks on. They told us when we were there, we were in front of our city hall, they're like, hey, make sure you guys have all your gear. We're going to have one portion of our officers fully geared in riot gear in case it goes completely sideways. But for you guys are just going to wear your regular stuff. We just call it Class Bs, but I'll just call it like regular uniform. We wear regular uniform, but make sure you have your gas mask at hand. Don't have it out or anything like that, just having your little pouch attached to your side. And now, to be fair and try to be fair and everything, unfortunately, cursing at the police is being peaceful. Calling them names and everything is being peaceful. As an officer, your peace can never be disturbed by whatever that individual is saying to you. It does not matter what he is saying to you. He could say the most nastiest things. Unfortunately, like, I've seen it before. Like, I've seen not necessarily protesters, but just anybody in general. They'll say some really sexist stuff towards the females, or they'll say a lot of stuff, especially like towards black officers. Unfortunately, like, I've heard them call them Uncle Toms and worse things I will not say on this podcast. But all that stuff, like, that is technically peaceful towards the officers. The moment things start getting thrown and everything like that, that's when the riot gear starts coming out. That's when the shields start coming out. We were also taught that we cannot accidentally trap them in, because that can also cause a lot of fight or flight mentality. It's like, oh, they're trapping us in, we got to fight them and everything. And then it just turns into a brawl. The tools that we use, like pepper spray, tear gas, for the academy, our requirements is that we have to go into the gas chamber, experience what it's like to be tear gas and also pepper sprayed. When you're tear gas or pepper sprayed, you don't think about anything else, you think about yourself. That is the whole goal when you disperse tear gas, is that it's supposed to break down that mob mentality and think about, oh man, I can't breathe in this tear gas. Like, I'm choking, I'm coughing and everything, and I got to get out of this tear gas. So when they run out to get out of the tear gas, them coughing is actually them helping them breathe and everything. But that's how at least we're taught in my city, how to handle like violent crowds and everything. But luckily our protests were peaceful. And of course there were some rioters like here and there, but they were such a small group that we just handled them very efficiently. They weren't really a big problem.
Yeah, it seems like all the onus is on the police officer to keep his cool.
Yeah.
Keep the peace, don't escalate things. Is there any specific training in terms of what language to use, psychology, whatever to use to calm people down, especially during riots, that they taught you in the academy?
That I don't know. I just know that they tell us, like, once the crowd becomes violent, we have to use those tools. We have to use the tear gas and the pepper spray to disperse that crowd. I've never been into it. I've never been in a riot personally, so I don't really know how I would kind of react. But for all these things, like, I just remember you have to like make sure they have an avenue to leave. Like, you kind of have to give them the avenue to leave and everything. That was the biggest thing that I was taught, is that don't intentionally, of course, but also don't accidentally trap them in to where they start getting even more violent and everything. Because I think that unfortunately it happened in one city, I think Philadelphia, where they had to clear them out of the highway. They weren't allowed to be on the highway. And the crowd still went into the highway. And so they started tear gassing them and started pepper spraying them. But unfortunately, they were trying to leave, and then they ended up getting stuck to a very high fence, and they had to hop over the fence. Meanwhile, the cops were just tear gassing them. And I don't think they realized that they were actually trapping them in the tear gas. They were trapping them unintentionally. I saw the video footage and all of that. I was like, well, that kind of sucks. But plus, at the same time, they shouldn't be on the highway too.
Right.
Yeah.
There's always enough blame to go both ways.
Yeah.
If we want to be fair and balanced. Let's shift gear a little bit. Let's talk about just some general policing stuff in terms of protocols. So, for instance, I'm driving in your city, you pulled me over. What are some of the protocols you would like for me to follow as you approach my vehicle or as you pulled me over? What are some of those protocols I should keep in mind?
The most important thing is to hands on the steering wheel. I mean, that's probably the most common thing that you should do, is just hands on the steering wheel as we pull you over. And to be honest, it would be so great if I could take people on ride-alongs and show them how do we do traffic stops from our point of view. As we're pulling you over, we look through the rear window and see if there's any kind of sudden movements. We call it dipping. Like, are you dipping forward? Like, I see your head kind of disappear, then pop back up. In other words, are you leaning forward in the driver's seat to hide something underneath or trying to pick something up? Are you shifting too much on the center console, or are you trying to grab something from the glove compartment? Now, you may be getting your driver's license or your wallet from those areas, but if you're doing it too much, it kind of makes us think a little bit. It's like, okay, what's this guy doing? I need to be a little bit more aware about what this guy's pulling, because handguns can be very concealable in cars. And traffic stops are incredibly dangerous for police officers. And I think domestics are dead even with those as well too. So domestic violence and traffic stops are very dangerous for cops. That's why we take those very seriously.
Is it just wise for that person to wait before they grab their driver's license, insurance?
It would be just wise just to have the hands on the steering wheel and just wait for us to go up there. Because as we're running the tag, we can see you from behind and see what's going on for the most part, like what you're doing. But in general, that's what you should do.
Yeah, talking about running tags, I know at least in my state, if they run your tag, they can tell whether or not you're a CCW permit holder or not. I know in your state is a little bit different because my state is a shall issue. I think your state is a may issue.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different, but how does the protocol change what you just explained to me if the person have some sort of concealed weapon permit?
Yeah, so if they do tell us that you have like a concealed carry permit, and in my city, I do run into some folks that do have concealed carry permits. They do show, like some of them are law enforcement, and some of them show the badge of like, okay, cool, okay, and thank you for letting me know and all that kind of stuff. But if it's just a regular civilian and he says, hey, I got a concealed carry permit, usually they're actually like they're the best people to deal with because they're like, hey, I got a concealed carry permit. The handgun is either waistband or like it's on my 9 o'clock, for example, you know what I mean? And then my wallet's here, and then my registration's in the glove compartment. Where do you want me to go first? And it's like, okay, just go for this. You can go for that. It'll be good. Now, for our training, at least in my department, I have my hand on my gun like the entire time, even if you do tell me you have a concealed carry permit or if you don't. So, and that's just because there's a percentage of uncertainty of what you're going to do. But in general, if you do have a concealed carry permit, I respect that. Like, I respect people's Second Amendment rights. I'm a big fan of the Second Amendment myself, so I do respect citizens' rights for that. But in general, if you just tell us, like, hey, it's here and everything, where would you like me to go? And then we can say, fine, we can direct you from there.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions in my mind from that. The first one would be, you said you have your hand on your gun. Do you blade your body in any way so the person don't see you have your hand on your gun? Or because I imagine that might escalate a little bit in the civilian mind.
Yeah, I can understand that it could escalate. So usually on cars, there's like the A pillar, but where the door meets, where it opens, that's called the B pillar. I usually have my body bladed. I try to be discreet about my hand on the firearm. I know what you're saying, so I don't want to scare the individual and everything. But I have it there, just have it bladed, just try not to make them see that I have it, had the hand on in the holsters.
And another thing that's big in the States, I know, at least the state I am in, I don't have to tell a police officer if I get pulled over in my state that I have a concealed carry permit, or even if I have a gun on me or weapon on me. But usually most of the stuff I read and stuff like that, they would say, hey, just go ahead and tell the police officer, get it out of the way rather than him asking. And I know in some states like Michigan, I think that must be the first thing that come out of your mouth.
Right.
Where do you stand on that?
It's kind of like, for me, it's like state to state. If you don't want to tell them, okay, that's fine. But like, I'd rather have you say, hey, just let you know I have this on me and everything. And to be honest, like, should it be like legally mandated or whatever? I would let that up to the states. But from a police officer perspective, and maybe somebody else has a different opinion about this, I don't know. But I just think that maybe, you should just advise the officer when you pull it over, hey, I got a concealed carry permit, all this kind of stuff. Now, if you're just walking about, I don't think you need to tell anybody. I don't think you need to tell a cop. But if you are in a situation, if you have to interact with an officer, I would suggest it.
Yeah, it does seem wise to me, actually, just to get it out of the way. And I think it actually de-escalate things a little bit, knowing that if you're telling the officer, I imagine that you don't have an intention to harm the officer,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
When we are in any interaction with the police, is it smart to plead the fifth or to invoke the fourth? Or when would that be appropriate?
So in general, like, unless you're put under arrest, we're going to interrogate you. Like, we're going to question you right on the spot. We have to advise your Miranda rights and everything. So you do have the right to remain silent. You don't have to say anything. But we have to advise you your Miranda rights if we are going to question you. And you can say, I don't want to talk to you or anything like that, but we must do that per the Constitution and everything. It's really up to you. I mean, like, I know what I have to do in order for me to talk to you in reference to like a crime or something like that. But if you just start saying, like, I plead the fifth or I plead the fourth, and you're not like really in trouble or anything like that, it's like I'm kind of looking at you kind of weird.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of looking at you kind of like, okay, all right then. But in general, like, you can do that. That is your right. I will respect that. So I have a constitution to enforce and uphold and everything. So
Right, and I mean, imagine, because a lot of folks, I think, sometimes go quickly to the fifth and the fourth because they want to make it clear they're not going to say anything, and also want to make it clear that they don't want their car to be searched. And there was this documentary I was watching, and I don't remember what it says, but there's a police officer would use certain kind of, scheme or whatever to force people to allow them to search their cars and stuff like that. And I guess sometimes folks just want to make it clear, hey, I'm not going to allow you to search, and I'm not going to say anything.
That's completely fine, unless we have like probable cause. And for those who don't know what probable cause is enough trustworthy evidence that a crime has been or is about to be committed. Once you have probable cause, you can make an arrest. Once you have probable cause, we can write a warrant. We can go to the court commissioner, write a warrant or a criminal summons, what have you. And again, when we search a vehicle, right? When we search a vehicle, it can only be within what we call the wingspan. So if you are in the driver's seat, I can only really search within the wingspan, for example, a weapon. Now, if I'm looking for drugs or anything like that, I can't exactly remember how I can search it or when I can search it, but there is a certain extent what we can do with the car as well, too. But most of the people that start saying that kind of stuff, they're kind of more or less being a pain when you start saying that. And so I try to, for example, when someone starts doing that, I try to help them out. It's kind of like you have to barter, for lack of a better term, with these folks who are trying to be hard. It's like, listen, man, we're just trying to do this, trying to do that. There are some times where like, listen, bro, if you don't give me this, you're going to go to jail. Like, you have to do that. Sometimes that is the barter system. Like, you don't give me this, you're going to go to jail because of this. But like, for example, I cannot identify you for an assault. Like, if I can't verifiably identify you, then I have to take you to prison. But I mean, other than that, like, you can say that all you want, but we are trained and we are refreshed every year on how to interact with the Fifth and Fourth Amendment and everything.
Yeah, let's shift gears again. How would you define a bad police officer? I know a lot of times people paint a broad brush, want to say all police are bad or all police are good. How would you personally define a bad police officer?
A bad police officer for me would be in different levels. You obviously have like the ones like Derek Chauvin with the George Floyd incident, but you also have a level of like someone with like a bad apathy, someone with like a lack of empathy, and someone who doesn't really care. You also have like lazy officers who just do stuff to get by. And I understand, like, there's some days where it's just absolutely crazy. It's just day after day, like a car's flipped over, everything's on fire, and you're just burnt out. And that may be the result why they are lazy or they're apathetic or they're, that lack of empathy. But a bad police officer comes in different ways. In many ways, to kind of circle to our Christian faith and everything. When I was at my Bible study here in my young adult group, I kind of mentioned that like a bad police officer is almost like a bad Christian in a sense. We all kind of know those really terrible representations of the faith. In my young adult group, they're saying like, there's some of these like people, they're just terrible. They're just not good Christians whatsoever. And they're just representing the faith terribly. It's the same thing with a police officer in many ways. If someone's from the outside who's not a police officer or who's not part of the Christian faith and their first interaction is with this individual, the whole thing's going to get stained. And it just tears down the unity between two people or two groups or just taints the group representation. So I always look at it as like that. I mean, other than that, like, there's just a lot of cleaning up to do. And for me, I always try to clean up house. As much as what's going on today, I know I can't really control what they do. I have to control and maintain and repair what's happening in my house. I got to clean my own room, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I would imagine that there's a good distinction between a bad police officer and maybe a dangerous police officer. Because you mentioned like Derek Chauvin. I think he's probably more on the dangerous side rather than the bad side. Yeah. They also, if you're a bad police officer, you might be on the road going down the dangerous road. You might you can flip a switch and become the dangerous type. So, yeah.
If you had to put a percentage on how much of the police force is bad, how much would you estimate, in your opinion? What percentage would you say is of the police force would you consider to be bad in your opinion?
So you might know this, Jay, for like being in the Marine Corps. I don't know if you may have heard this or not, but when I was in the Marine Corps, they've always said there's always that 10%.
10%. Yep. 10%. Mm-hmm.
So I say it's about 10% that just ruined it for the rest of us. I'm solid about that because I always, that is so true. It's just everywhere. It doesn't matter what profession it is. It's always that 10%. So that's why I put it at. Now, is it more? Is it less? I don't know. Like, we have to look into that more, but I'm always solid in a 10%. So
yeah, I'm a software engineer. I'm sure there's the 10% in the software engineer world too. So yeah, so there's definitely always that set of humans that no matter what profession you're in, going to be spoiling it for the rest.
People are people, right?
Talking about bad police officers have this thing that is called qualified immunity that has become extremely political over the last year or so in terms of whether or not we should remove it. Does police officer have immunity against crime? And I know one side of the political aisle is saying remove it, another side is saying keep it. How would you define qualified immunity? And do you think that if we remove qualified immunity from police officers, do you think how many of the force you think would quit? What do you think the force would look like? Just talk about qualified immunity in a general.
So qualified immunity was I think it was a Supreme Court decision that said that protects not just police officers, but also protects government officials. If they are working within their duties, they cannot be individually sued. It does not protect them from being criminally charged. For example, the George Floyd incident, all those officers being charged.
Right.
They're being criminally charged. In my city, we had something, and they were, if you ever seen Denzel Washington's Training Day, they were essentially doing that. They got criminally charged and criminally convicted. They received no help from the police unions, and they were not protected from qualified immunity. What it does is it protects you from making, say, for example, like a reasonable mistake. Right. So, for example, I always usually give is, say you get a call for a bank robbery. Suspect's running this, and that. He has an unknown caliber handgun, black in color. You get up there, you see the suspect, you start running towards him, you start engaging him. He pulls out the handgun towards you, and then you shoot, and then you wind up killing him, or you wind up, grievously bodily harm towards this individual. Come to find out, the gun was actually a BB gun. Now, in that moment, did you know that was an actual BB gun or not? It's kind of hard, and especially now these days where these BB guns are almost the exact replica of an actual handgun.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, but in reference, if it did get to that kind of controversial issue, qualified immunity would protect you from being sued. Whether or not qualified immunity needs to be reformed, these controversial shootings to where the cops had some malice into it, or these shootings really were kind of absurd or something like that, to where you'll be able to punish these officers more harshly because of like what they did and all that kind of stuff. We can talk about that. Should it be completely removed? I honestly don't know. I always kind of fall back on is with G.K. Chesterton is that he said that before you remove any fence, you got to remember why it was put there in the first place. Based on what it looks like to me is that they're just yanking this thing out. They're just straight up yanking it. They're not even trying to replace it or anything. And a lot of more senior officers are just trying to just retire. They're just trying to not do what we call proactive enforcement, meaning you're actively looking for not necessarily crime, but you're looking for people who might or might not do wrong, like trying to get drugs or trying to like get illegal guns or even simple traffic stops. That's technically called a proactive enforcement. But I don't necessarily know how big of a rate of officers will leave the force or just early retire. But as the way that it's going right now, a lot of cops want to retire early to begin with this whole climate. If you get rid of this, I think, unfortunately, you might be causing more damage in the long run than if you just kept it in place. Try to build something to replace that so-called fence.
Yeah, I would imagine in the society that we live in where it's so easy, let's be honest, it's very easy to sue someone in the United States of America. Yeah. You might not win, but you can sue anyone for basically any reason. And if a police officer can't make a simple mistake, and I know sometimes I say simple mistake because a simple mistake might be a deadly mistake, but for a police officer not be able to make a mistake and not be liable civilly for that mistake, I think, to me, if I was a police officer, I would be glad if I know that, you know what, I can arrest someone that I honestly think fit a description, but it might be a mistake. I think there should be some level that they can allow to make a mistake, because you're asking the police officers to do a lot of judgment call. And at least for me, outside looking in, it seems like you're making another judgment call. You know, is this suspicious? Do I need to stop this person, or what the case may be? And if just by simply doing something, making a mistake, I can be sued and lose everything, you know, it seems like that the Supreme Court had something going there to say, hey, we're going to give them at least some sort of immunity from civil liabilities.
Yeah. And just to be clear, it doesn't just like cover police officers. It also covers judges as well, too.
Yeah, but judges have full immunity, though.
Yeah.
And that's what other people don't realize. The judges have full immunity. Again, it's not criminal. They're not immune from criminal activities. But in execution of their duties, they can't be sued in civil court.
Yeah.
Again, I just think that's, to me, would be very important for me if I was a police officer or if I was a government worker or whatever, to know that, hey, you know what, I can make a mistake. You know, maybe they can say the level of mistake. There's a simple mistake, and there's a knucklehead mistake, and there's an arrogant mistake. Yeah. So maybe they can put levels on it or whatever, but to totally remove it, for me, I wouldn't blame any police officer if they decide they're going to quit or they're not going to do proactive policing anymore. You have a family. You have, have, that's, at least just speaking that way, I would imagine that that's important. You're listening to the Removing Barriers podcast. We will continue our conversation with Officer CigarBro, and we will talk about social justice and policing.
Sometimes, no matter how great the selection, you just can't find exactly what you want. Design It Yourself custom gift baskets solve that problem by allowing you to choose the specific products you want to include with your unique gift basket. And in addition to hand selecting the products, you can further personalize your custom basket by adding coffee mugs, stuffed animals, mylar balloons, or even an imprinted ribbon. When you're done, we'll put it all together in a one-of-a-kind, perfect basket and ship or hand deliver it directly to your lucky recipient. Click in the description section to design your basket today.
So let's talk about social justice. Last summer, we had a bunch of issues pop up. We mentioned a little bit about George Floyd. We also had Breonna Taylor. We had Rashad Brooks. Let's talk a little bit about social justice. What is your professional opinion on the Breonna Taylor shooting?
Breonna Taylor shooting, I think that it was like a combined mistakes really on both sides. I think that like they did knock and they did announce. They have a witness that said that they did announce. And to be honest, and I'll just put this in here, body cam footage would have cleared this thing like through and through. It would have cleared this thing through and through. I was like, where's the body cam footage? Because the SWAT had it and then some other units had it, but they didn't. To me, I was just like, man, you got to be a fool not to have body cams. Like, I wanted body cams. I want them because it would clear so much evidence. It would clear so much.
Right.
In reference to this. But anyhow, the witness said that who knew that was happening because he stepped out of his apartment, which was above Breonna Taylor's house, and he was just listening in. He said that he heard them knock and announce. And that's what was determined in, I think, grand jury Kentucky. They stepped in and, they banged through the door, and then Kenneth Walker shot at one of the officers. Now, according to Kenneth Walker, they didn't hear the announcing. So in their mind, they think that somebody's invading their house. Therefore, they were justified in shooting. And what they thought were home invaders or anybody else. Who knows what that is. The officers were right in shooting back at Kenneth Walker because one of their officers got shot because they were conducting their duties of doing a search and seizure warrant. The other mistakes, unfortunately, were the two officers who went around the side towards the front of like the apartment complex and towards the windows, and they just started shooting into the apartment. And there had no visual identity of like a suspect firing back. In their interviews, they were saying they were shooting at the muzzle flashes, but in reality, they were shooting at the police's muzzle flashes. Kenneth Walker only shot once. So if anything, a lot of mistakes that were made in this it wasn't no knock warrant, but then you had the knock and announce. So in this warrant for the house, but the shooting was justified for the police because Kenneth Walker shot back at them and they were performing their duties. To me, it was just a giant tragedy. And unfortunately, there was so much misinformation when this first came out. Like, people were saying that, like, it came out as she was sleeping and they broke into the house and shot her while she was sleeping and all that kind of stuff. And they charged, like, Kenneth Walker with first-degree murder and all that kind of stuff. He was charged with first-degree murder, but then once more facts came out, the charges were dropped. That happens all the time, by the way, with criminal charges. They can be dropped by the prosecutor once they get enough evidence. But based on what I've been researching with New York Times and everything, it was just really a tragic incident,
right,
of poor mistakes and poor police tactics. And to me, it's just like, man, this could have been done a lot better. But the shooting was justified. And I think a lot of people don't seem to understand the difference between, like, it's justified. Just because it's justified doesn't mean that, like, it was necessarily good. Like,
right,
there seems to be a binary. Yeah. Doesn't mean, like, it was like they put a bow tie at the end of it, to put it all right. So, but that's just my one opinion.
Right. And I imagine those police officers that were shooting through the window or through the back sliding door, one of the rules of firearm safety is to identify your target and know what's behind of it. And, it's definitely wasn't able to do that. But I do agree with you because I think that folks tend not to think that police have a right to defend their life, but police officers do have a right to defend their life. And whether Kenneth Walker made an honest mistake by shooting what he believed was home invaders, the police officers had a right to shoot back because in their mind they announced, and Kenneth Walker in his mind, they didn't announce that these are home invaders. So as I say, again, I believe, it's just a tragedy all around that unfortunately Breonna Taylor died, but the police officers had a right to defend themselves, just like Kenneth Walker had a right to fire a shot. And
by the way, the officers, at least one of them, that shot around on the front, he's being charged with wanton endangerment.
Right.
So, if anything, based on this court case, the justice system was doing its part. It did its part. They found that one of the officers was recklessly shooting, not visually identified as his target, and now he's been charged with wanton endangerment.
Right.
And so, to me, it's like this system, while imperfect, this system is second to none.
Oh, definitely.
How common are no-knock warrants, and are they dangerous, or how dangerous are they? We're talking about the Breonna Taylor case, and the no-knock warrant was pretty much at the center of that. Are they common, and how dangerous are they?
For me, I never participated. I'm so new that I have not participated in no-knock warrants, but they are incredibly dangerous because of what happened with that Breonna Taylor shooting. That could actually happen. Now, to dive into like how a search warrant is done, search and seizure warrant needs to have enough evidence that there is something in there that you can use that is like a tools of the crime or something like that, fruits of the crime, meaning like large caches of money that they stole from the bank or anything like that. So you need a search warrant to get into the house in order to obtain evidence. A no-knock warrant is allowed if the person is incredibly dangerous, like he has weapons, or evidence is going to be immediately destroyed if you knock and announce. I.e., if drugs are being used, if you have a drug house and you knock on there, you announce that you are police, it's going to go into the bathtub, it's going to go into the toilet, it's going to go into the sink. By the time you bang into the door and search the house, there is no evidence. That's what the no-knock warrants are for. The search and seizure warrants and no-knock warrants are signed by judges. They are ultimately signed by the judges. Some judges are like, they'll put a red line through the paper, like you're in high school, like you're in fifth grade or something. And then other judges will just sign it like it's, okay, cool. We'll just sign it. But it depends on who that is. No-knock warrants, they're kind of rare. And usually you have a team like SWAT. You have SWAT teams that will do this along with drug teams. You wouldn't really have, like me, like a patrol officer doing a no-knock warrant because it's just so dangerous. And not only that, in the search and seizure warrant that I forgot to mention, the color of the door and what's on the door and what's around the door has to be described in the search and seizure warrant. Because why? Because people can knock the wrong houses. I think about maybe 10% of all search warrants, the wrong doors are knocked down. So you have to put in, like, for example, like, we'll just use my door, for example. Like, I have a white door. It's got a silver door handle that's kind of flat, and it has the numbers 1, 2, 3 on the center of the door. In front of the white door is a glass storm door in front of it that's silver in color. In front of that door is a brown in color rug saying welcome in green in color. And that's how descriptive they have to be with the doors, because those police officers might be off, or police officers in general will just, they may mistake in the wrong door for the door for them to bust down if they have to bust it down. So that's how dangerous they are. And we have to make sure that we want to prevent things just like that Breonna Taylor shooting or something even worse.
Yeah, I would imagine, because with a country that has more guns than people and has the Second Amendment rights and stuff like that, you know, the argument can be even made, no knock warrant even wise to do, because as you said, you know, 10% of no knock warrants are the wrong home. And I would imagine that if I hear my door is being beaten down, my wife and I are going into emergency mode. And the emergency mode meaning she going to go and get the kids, and I'm going to go into a strategic place where I can see the front door, but they can't see me. And I'm going to have more than my voice making noise. Yeah. So in my mind, I'm thinking I would probably do the same thing Kenneth Walker did, maybe with a much more powerful weapon. So the wisdom in this, what do you say about the wisdom in this? Do you think that there's some times that it's definitely necessary, or there are times when you say, hey, you know what, we shouldn't do it at all?
It should be, we have an actual paper that has a chart for all the evaluations. It's pretty much like a check mark to say, like, all right, does he have weapons? Is he known to be violent? What does he have, and what do you suspect that he might have in the house? And then it kind of like, it's like a point system. And if it reaches like a point system, then we need to be able to argue, hey, we need a no-knock warrant for this individual because he's incredibly dangerous. We don't want to give him, say, for example, time to get said weapon, and then he's like shooting you with a long gun. And now it's a massive fight. Whereas you bust down with no-knock warrant, you get him while he's sleeping, then there's no fight to be had. So it has to be very, especially now these days, and I'm certain like many officers who are like more senior than me, we don't want to just be busting down people's doors without actual confirming that we have to do that. But yeah, we have to cross our T's, dot our I's for this type of stuff.
What about the unfortunate and sad situation surrounding George Floyd? What's your professional opinion on the killing of George Floyd?
The George Floyd thing, it's not long and hard about this. This was just a very devastating thing. 8-minute video came out.
Right.
And you see the officer just kind of just very apathetic. I don't know if there was any malice involved, but he definitely was like, I don't really care that this guy's saying that I can't breathe and everything. And he's got the neck restraint on him. Then a couple of months later, we have the full 30-minute video of one of the rookie officers who made the initial contact with George Floyd in the vehicle. And then for me, it went from like, this is like still devastating, but it was like, this was even more devastating because unfortunately it looked like George Floyd was overdosing.
Right.
And the autopsies all point to that too. Now, does that excuse Officer Chauvin for what he did for his treatment of him after he was like passing out and stuff? No, I don't think so. And I do want him to get charged. I don't know if he's going to get second-degree murder. I don't know if he's going to get third-degree murder. I understand if he got hit with third-degree murder. That would make sense. But as he was going through the whole, his mannerisms and everything, it sounded like he was overdosing. And the two rookie officers, who, by the way, only had like 3 days on the job, they were all like, listen, man, well, as we're trying to get him into the car, into the back of the police car, they're like, listen, man, we'll open the window up for you. We'll turn on the AC. Listen, you got to work with us. You got to just get inside. And meanwhile, George Floyd is just kind of like, I'm going to die in there. I can't breathe. He was saying I can't breathe before he was put on the ground. And he asked to be put on the ground.
Right.
And when they made the initial contact with him, there were two other black people in the car. There's a black female and a black male.
Right.
And they're talking to us like, hey, what's wrong with your guy over here? And what's wrong with him over there? Like, is there something up? And the female's like, no, he's got something going on up there. I said, okay. It's like, he's just acting real squirrely. Those two individuals, they obeyed with what the officer commanded. Like, he told him to drop the bag. He dropped the bag. He gave him the ID when he asked. And then they never dealt with him again. They never talked with him again. They were dealing with George Floyd because he was the suspect in the forgery crime.
Right.
Now, I don't know what their laws are in Minnesota, but in my state, we would just write a citation. We just get his identification, and then we would say, hey, go press charges for the forgery. I guess in Minneapolis, they allowed them to arrest them. That's enough probable cause to arrest someone for forgery. Now, with Officer Chauvin, the next restraint that he was doing on him, he was trained to do that because there was actually a PowerPoint, and on that slide, it shows the exact same thing that he was doing. Now, to be fair, he should have stopped doing that when he got put in the handcuffs. But once they had him, like, he was on the ground and everything, on the PowerPoint, it says what to do after the individual or the suspect is in custody, i.e. he's in handcuffs. You turn him over to something called the recovery position, which means that, say, for example, if I was there and I'm already doing that neck restraint and everything, and then he's already secured, he's kind of doing like this relatively low active resistance towards us, but he's already restrained and there's three of us here, you would get off of him and then you would like grab his arm and then his leg and then you would turn him to his side. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we call the recovery position. Yes, he was trained by that. I don't think it was good training. I think it was terrible training, to be honest, because now look where we're at almost a year later. But all of those combinations together, it just ended up being a devastating thing. Because to me, when I was watching that, it's like I felt bad for George Floyd. I was like, dude, like he's overdosing. The two rookies were trying to help. Then you got Officer Chauvin, who's been on the force for 17 years, had, I think, maybe almost 20 years.
Yeah, 19 years, I think.
He had like 17 misconduct complaints. He had 2 police-involved shootings in his career. That right there, I can see how somebody can become that. I can see how somebody can become that, at worst malicious, and at best maybe apathetic towards George Floyd. I still think the treatment of him was completely inhumane, especially after when he went unconscious. And I think, like, unfortunately, with older officers, more senior officers who don't have to deal with all the cameras and the social media and the body cameras and everything like that, the unfortunate thing now these days is that if it doesn't look good on camera, then it's not good at all. Never good at all. And that's unfortunately what we have to work with. And I'm fine with working that. You know, I was raised in this type of era. But for these older officers, they don't seem to get that. But I think that Derek Chauvin should be charged. I don't know if he's going to get second-degree murder, though. The other 2 officers and the one officer who's trying to keep the crowd back, I don't know if they're going to get aiding and abetting. I mean, to me, it was just a very, very devastating thing that happened, and I immediately felt the heat. The one silver lining thing, at least for a brief moment, was that everybody was in universal agreement that this was wrong. Right. This shouldn't have happened. He shouldn't have put the neck restraint on George Floyd or anything like that. This was a universal agreement. And I thought, at least it was like, this is tragic. Yes, I'm going to be taking the heat and everything, but at least I can bring forward some of my ideas, at least my opinions or my ideas towards like police reform in the sense of like a mutual benefit. I think, Jay, you mentioned that earlier, that in order to make the police better, we need to actually help them in some areas so they can actually become the better force that we want. But unfortunately, the riots happened, and then we were back on the same post. And to me, I was just devastated by it. You know, I was just praying the entire time during the riots, and I was like, man, I just hope that we get something. There's got to be something coming good out of this. But you know, we'll have to wait and see what God does with all of that.
Yeah, definitely. For me, and we dealt with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, episode 2, where we talk about systemic racism, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. For me, for Derek Chauvin, it was more that, as you said, I think there was a level of defiance on his face. Yeah. Like, yeah, I'm going to do this, whatever. And even people were telling him, hey, you can't breathe, you can't breathe. There was just this level of nonchalant, like, almost like I do this every day and this is nothing to me.
Yeah.
And realizing that he's on the neck of a human being. And So, but I noticed a pattern, and I don't know if I'm correct in this pattern, but I noticed a pattern that, like in George Floyd, Eric Gardner, and others involved, there normally is a multiple police involved, but no police intervene.
Yeah.
So in the Eric Gardner case, it was like 6 or 7 officers, and he was saying he can't breathe. But none of the officers say, hey, let him go, let him go, let him go. He said he can't breathe, give him some space. In the George Floyd situation, it was the same thing.
Yeah.
I understand there were 2 rookie officers, but no one intervened and say, hey, get off his neck, he can't breathe. And I understand the fact that if your training officer is actually doing something as a rookie officer, it's going to take a whole lot of courage for you to actually speak up. But there's some things that are so shocking to the soul that, you know, if you see someone beating up a child, you know, no matter how quiet you are, whatever the case may be, you're probably going to intervene.
Yeah.
And to me, seeing someone with the knee on someone's neck and the person is on the verge of dying saying they can't breathe and no one intervened, to me, it was like, is there some kind of secret code that officers use that say, hey, we're never going to correct each other in public? Maybe when we're in the meeting room and the dressing room, we might correct each other and say, hey, probably shouldn't have done that. But in public, no. Is there such a thing in the police, some kind of bromance that say, hey, I'm not going to interfere with your duties. I'm going to back you up no matter what?
There is it's a type of culture essentially, and it's more or less out of, I guess it kind of gotten toxified over the years, but it was more or less like, to me, a sign of respect is that you don't you respect the senior officers, of course, but you also you don't step on each other's toes. You try to let them handle the call for service by themselves. And right now, like, there's already cities, or there has been cities that have already tried to implement a duty to intervene. Now, some people say that there is a retaliation if you say something or speak up with something against the officers, and then the squad or the precinct that you're working at turns against you. And there have been instances in that past where that has happened. You have to create the culture to where it is okay to tell someone that. And to go back onto the George Floyd thing, there was one rookie in the body cam footage who was saying, hey, don't you think we should turn him over? Like, you know, there's excited delirium. And Derek Chauvin was like, nah, the medic's on the way. We got the medic. That's what the medic's for. And he was like, oh, okay. Like, he was like, okay. But to me, that's still not enough, man. You got to at least try to do something, in my opinion. It's good that he had some human element, at least the newer guys did, but he needed to do something more. And that's why, unfortunately, he's getting charged right now. But for the culture to change, it has to be acceptable for other officers to correct other officers in public. It can be hard sometimes where, like, if you're getting angry with a suspect, you want to keep that ego down. It can be hard, but the change can happen, and it's already happening in other cities as well, too. So, in many ways, the way that I look at it, when you have to intervene somebody, is like, hey, do this for you, not for them. Like, I always say that for when, like, someone got assaulted, like, it's something not so big like a robbery, for example, but something like a dispute or like a landlord-tenant dispute. I say, listen, do this for you. Do this for your sake. Don't do this for us. Don't do this for me. I'm just telling you to do so-and-so so you can benefit in the long run. So the culture in the police has to be changed into a better way. So I had a long time thinking about this, long and hard about this, but that is one of the things that I think that the police do need to be reformed. And again, I'm not saying that old mentality was bad. I think it grew. I think it got toxified, if you understand what I'm saying. It got poisoned over time, and it rotted over time. And now this is where we're at in some departments.
Yeah, and I think you see it as well in other areas. Let's say for family, there's some parents who would not correct their child to an extent where the child, no matter what the child does, the child is always right.
Yeah.
The type of children you create or raise during that time make it really bad. Yeah. You never tell the child, hey, that's wrong, or whatever the case may be. And so I get it, the respect level, I want to respect this officer, whatever the case may be. But most things, when you take it too far, it becomes toxic. And I definitely see what you're saying.
But at the same time, in that situation, George Floyd was resisting arrest, and he was obviously under the influence of some drug or something like that. And I would imagine it's very difficult to arrest someone like that, not only resisting arrest, but also under the influence of something. How difficult is it to arrest someone like that?
It can be very difficult. Unfortunately, and this is one of my main things that I'm trying to push forward. And I think out of all things, it needs to be pushed forward. It needs to be the tip of the spear amongst all this police reform that we're talking about. It needs to be fitness, and it needs to be some type of martial arts, particularly Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. George Floyd I don't know how tall he is. He looks like he's 6 foot something. I don't know how big he is.
Well over 6 foot.
Yeah, so he's a big guy, and they're trying to get him in. And the thing is, I always tell people, a lot of folks are like, why didn't they just do this? Why didn't they just do this? Like, well, you have to understand, when you're trying to arrest somebody or trying to control someone without hurting him is incredibly difficult, especially if you don't have any type of martial arts kind of experience or background. With Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it doesn't require any type of striking. There's no punches, there's no kicking. Now, there is chokeholds. And that's what a lot of people tell me. Is like, isn't there chokeholds, like a rear naked choke and all these other chokeholds as well? I said, yes, there is. But at the same time, if you teach the whole martial art, not just the chokehold part of it, but you teach them the whole martial art, they'll be able to do other techniques. Say, for example, it's like a side control. For those who are probably listening, they know what I'm talking about, but I'll try to explain it the best I can. It's where you are pinning, for lack of a better term, pinning the person. You're on top, and you're pinning him with your chest on his chest, and you're kind of using your shoulder to turn his head. If his head is facing up towards the sky, you're turning his head away from you so he can't turn into you. And so that'll actually hold him down. And again, there's other things like actually sitting on top of him and trying to control his arms and everything. And I can go into depth about that. But those simple positions, you can hold a person down, and you can hold him down until backup arrives, or until he like gasses out and he's like, ugh, and it's like, all right, I give up. And then you can use your techniques in order to put his hands behind his back and get the handcuffs on him. But I think that someone resisting arrest, it can be incredibly difficult. You also, depending on the person, you also don't want to hurt them as well too, because you know the implications of what happens. Like, you don't want to send them to the hospital. The last thing I want to do after, especially doing all this, doing the martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, was like, the last thing I wanted to do was fight somebody, because I know how taxing it is. Like, I've been thrown around by black belts, and you wouldn't even think that these people could kick your on the street. Like, some of these are women, some of these are really lanky dudes, and they'll just tie you up in a knot. And I think that's unfortunately, one of the things that's been put on the side for police officers, because they're telling us to, hey, no chokeholds, or at least no chokeholds until deadly force, or like, you can't be doing this, you can't be doing that, you can't be doing this. And I'm fine with that, but you got to replace it. It's circling back to what I said before. They're yanking this fence without wondering what they're going to do with it, or why was it put there in the first place. This arguably is one of the most frustrating things, is trying to push this in there. Sometimes I feel like I'm hitting my head against a brick wall sometimes. And that's just one of the things. It can be difficult. And I feel bad for some of my coworkers where they're trying to put the person's arm behind their back, but they're doing it in a way to where they're accidentally hurting him. And because he's getting hurt with his shoulder getting thrown, he's resisting more. Whereas, like, I kind of know how to do it. There was one instance where I had to arrest this female for trespassing, something really simple. I put him into something called a Kimura, which is like, you have your arm over the shoulder, and then you grab her arm, and then you kind of overlap. You overlap one of your arms and grab the other arm, your own arm. If hopefully that made sense. But regardless, you put your hand behind your back. My other partner had the female's arm. One hand was underneath the elbow, and the other hand was pushing down on her wrist. My body camera actually fell off during this not really huge struggle, but it's like really minute for me, at least. My body camera falls down and facing up, and the female was yelling at one of us, like, "You're bending my arm, you're bending my arm." I was like, bending your arm? Like, is she yelling at me? And come to find out, she was actually yelling at my partner, because her arm was almost in a armbar position. I mean, you wouldn't be able to break it the way that he was holding it, but it was actually hurting her. And therefore, she was actually resisting more, because the pain was actually making her reject complying. You know what I'm saying? You understand what I'm saying? So if these police officers knew these tools, then they wouldn't have to unfortunately shoot someone, or they wouldn't have to beat them with a baton. They wouldn't have to, only use a rear naked choke because they don't know anything else or anything like that, for somebody who might not be trying to kill you, but is like kind of like trying to get away and stuff like that. You don't know how to handle him. So that's what I think needs to be on the forefront, as well as being physically fit in your profession as well too.
As you were talking, on the light side of this, as you were talking, I think about the episode of Walker, Texas Ranger, where Walker, I don't remember what particular episode this was, but Walker walk up to the bad guy, and both of them put their guns down, because instead of using your gun, Walker is going to use his fist to subdue this guy before he arrests him. It sounds like he wanted to turn all the officers into Chuck Norris or something. I don't know. It's just, at least have his kind of training.
Wish.
Yeah,
I wish I could turn them into, all ninjas or all the Rangers as well too. So
yeah,
I wish that was the case, but
sometimes no matter how great the selection, you just can't find exactly what you want. Design It Yourself custom gift baskets solve that problem by allowing you to choose the specific products you want to include with your unique gift basket. And in addition to hand selecting the products, you can further personalize your custom basket by adding coffee mugs, stuffed animals, mylar balloons, or even an imprinted ribbon. When you're done, we'll put it all together in a one-of-a-kind, perfect basket and ship or hand deliver it directly to your lucky recipient. Click in the description section to design your basket today.
Yeah, so let's shift to Jacob Blake. Jacob Blake was probably the most recent one. Maybe Rashad Brooke might be. But what's your professional opinion on Jacob Blake? Do you think his shooting was justified in terms of the officer fired 7 shots, 4 hit him in the back, it was close range? What's your professional opinion on Jacob Blake?
So Jacob Blake, I do think it was justified based upon, there were just so many things that has now come out. And initially when it came out, I was like, well, this looks bad. This looks really bad. But for some reason, I had something in the back of my mind that was like, why are they not trying to tackle this dude and put him onto the ground? This doesn't really make any sense. Come to find out, he actually had a knife on him. And that was the reason why I didn't try to grapple him. But for those who don't know I'll give the kind of a brief synopsis of what happened with Jacob Blake here and everything. The officers were called by a female who is a actual sexual assault victim from Jacob Blake. And the female was calling saying that, hey, he took my keys, my kids are in the car is a rental, a lot of kind of stuff. I need you guys come here. The officers come there, and on the way there, they run his name. Apparently, the female may have given Jacob Blake's name and date of birth, which allows us to run through something called NCIC, which is a criminal background check, essentially. It gives you prior history of warrants or active warrants or what were you arrested for. And it kind of gives you a brief tool. Not only that, as they're going there, they're like, all right, he got active warrants. And usually what we have to do, at least for my department, we have a record management system that we have to call in order to confirm that this warrant is still active, that it's not that it still has to be served. So once they confirmed that, they had no choice but to arrest Jacob Blake. It's not like, hey, man, we got a warrant for your arrest, but it's like, nah, I don't want to do it. All right, cool. We'll see you tomorrow. That's just not how it works. That's just not how any of this works. So they had to arrest him. Again, this is also another thing similar to Breonna Taylor, where if body camera was there, this could clear up a lot of things. But unfortunately, they didn't have the budget. This department didn't have the budget for it, at least until next year. But they had going forth, he has a knife. They get into a tussle. They tase him. They tase him twice. And apparently, Jacob Blake pulled the probes off of the taser. And a lot of people don't seem to realize that tasers really only have a 60% effectiveness. When they work well. But when they don't work, it's because of simple baggy clothing. The dude might be on drugs. The person may be like Jacob Blake. He's able to pull one of the probes or both of the probes off. And there's maybe some other factors as well, too. It's unfortunately, it's really reliable when it is reliable. But when it's not, you got to use other options. So when he had the knife, they unfortunately couldn't like get up to him and try to put him into custody because he had a knife. And then they were walking around him. Unfortunately, they had to shoot him because he was reaching into the car. You can hide so many things in cars. You can hide guns as well as drugs and everything like that. Unfortunately, also, I think his children, or he may be the child's father to that mother, whoever called on him. The children were also in the vehicle as well, too. Now, during all this circumstance, if I'm in that situation and I hear that the mother's saying, he's got the keys in my car, my kids are in the car, the worst thing that could happen would be a kidnapping, and then you're chasing the vehicle with kids in the car. Meanwhile, the suspect just assaulted you and tried stabbing you with a knife, and then now you got to worry about kids getting hurt and injured in a vehicle pursuit. So then they ran out of options and shot him. Do I wish that they didn't shoot Jacob Blake? No. I really wish that they had some other way to get the knife out, get the knife off of him, disarm him with the knife, and then put him into custody, and then that would be it. But they unfortunately had to shoot him, and I think that would be, in my opinion, that was justified based upon the circumstances. To me, this one is also sad because now the kids witnessed, if I done my research correctly, the kids had to witness all of this. Like, I felt terrible for the children as well. As like they had to witness all of this happening, and then the child's mother had to witness happening as well too. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff with Jacob Blake and that victim as well. But going on with Jacob Blake's like victim, the female, it was so. She did everything that she did with the police. The police actually helped her with getting the restraining order, getting charges pressed on Jacob Blake and everything. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that people don't seem to realize. And when I try to talk to people, people who are willing to listen, not just, yell, scream, and shout, they're actually not aware of this. This is months after this incident has happened, after, unfortunately, that the damage is done. Now that Kenosha is, like, all the businesses are set on fire. Now nobody's talking about it. To me, that upsets me. That, like, it's just like, it's all crickets. Like, come on, guys, we have to talk about this. If we want genuine police reform, we have to talk about all these cases months after this all happened. And so then we can actually improve the police. We can actually get the reform that we all want, and me included.
Isn't that indicative of what's going on in the country, though? Because no one wants to talk to anybody. Everyone went in the little corner and decide, hey, why do I need to talk to this person over here? These are our demands, but they never look at the other side. That's why, like, for instance, that's why I want to talk to the police. That's why I want to hear the opposite side. That's why I listen to Republicans. That's why I listen to Democrats, because I want to hear both sides. I don't want to be hearing one side is bad and one side is good, or whatever the case may be. Let's talk. Let's hear both sides, because what was going through that officer's mind when he shoot? Why is it that he found it necessary to shoot? What was going to Jacob Blake's mind? If we're not going to talk, we're just going to say, hey, it's because he's black. It's because he's this.
Yeah.
And for the record, culturally, everyone will look at me, they will say I'm black. I'm a black man living in the U.S., but I'm not afraid of the police officers, because I believe that there's a certain level of respect that you have to show to authority. And if I'm pulled over by a police, I'm going to be respectful to that officer. And quite honestly, if the officer do something that I feel was against my constitutional right, or whatever the case may be, I know at the end of the day, I can get a lawyer and sue. And sue the department, sue the city, whatever. And their recourse, but a lot of time we want to fight these battles at the side of the street.
Yeah.
So we talk about Jacob Blake, we talk about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Eric Gardner. And I'm asking this question as a person living in the U.S., as a black man living in the U.S. Do you think police officers have it out for blacks, especially young black men like myself?
No, not in the sense like we're actively looking at it for like racism or anything like that. Like we're trying to hunt them down like animals or anything. Not at least in my experience in my city, where the overwhelming majority of the citizenry is black people. And then not only that, like more than half of the police department is also black as well too. Now, undoubtedly, of course, you could go back maybe 20, 30 years ago, you would have a solid argument against that. And many times it was actually crimes of omission, where they left they left those parts of the areas where there were predominantly black people. It's like, you're on your own, you got to deal with the crime. So there's undoubtedly that type of systemic racism of that during that point, maybe 20 years or 30 years ago. But for today, we're literally trying to correct all of that. The system has been improved like overwhelmingly compared to like what happened, those decades past. To me, what a lot of people don't seem to realize is that, unfortunately, in the so-called black community, there's a lot of crime, and there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of crime. So we have to go there because of the crime. We go where the crime is. We go based off of the stats. We also stop individuals based off of what the victim is also saying too. If it's saying that it's a white person who's got, say for example, it's like a person who's got a blue sweatshirt and black sweatpants and he's got green socks on, we're going to look for that individual. If it happens to be black, we have to look at that individual as well too. And we also have to make sure that we confirm that it is that individual as well. But for me to say that police officers are hunting black men, it's unfortunately a very boogeyman kind of statement, if you ask me. I understand if you're saying like there seems to be a lot of black people being stopped by police officers, then we need to look into that and see if that actually is racism or if that's actually based off of crime statistics. Is that based off of like, what are we doing in reference to that? You have to look at all of that and then put yourself into account. And so unfortunately, people are just doing what I call car bumper sticker knowledge. They're just throwing things out there. You see the car bumper sticker knowledge, it's just like a little slogan. It's like, okay, I get that. But if you really dig into it, there's more into it. I personally just don't think that there is. Whether or not we have to try to help these communities to be better, I'm all for that. I see it firsthand. I see firsthand where you see the poverty, you see the crime, you see the violence that these communities have to face. I want to help these people. And a lot of people don't seem to realize this, is that the folks in these communities, the good, I would say good majority, of course, the 10% there's always there, but the 90% that are there, they want us there. They want us to be there to deter the crime, because nobody wants to have their kids play in the playground and then somebody was shot like around the corner. Nobody wants that. So they want us there. They're just, I understand from their point of view that they want better police. They just want, a police accountability. I completely understand that. And I'm willing to bridge that gap and try to make a compromise between the two.
Yeah, definitely. For me, and again, as a person outside looking in, I don't personally feel like I'm being hunted or I don't have a chance when it comes to a police officer pulling me over or whatever the case may be. But for me, I'm a fairly law-abiding citizen. I don't necessarily go out there breaking the law, and I don't do jogs. I don't, there's a lot of things, a lot of companies, people you associate yourself with that may, there's a saying that go trouble kind of follow trouble. If you're into jogs and all the stuff, you're going to have a higher interaction rate with police officers than someone who doesn't. My interaction rate with police officers is almost null because I don't tend to speed on the highways. I don't use jogs and all those things. So I have a very limited interaction with police officers. Some folks might have a little bit more higher interaction because of their lifestyle.
And I'm certain you don't live in a very high crime area where you may not talk to you. Yeah. So like we often go to the way that the police work was revolutionized was like in New York City, where they created this thing called CompStat, to where they look at it based on a statistical data. Like, for example, robberies went up 100% here. Shootings went up 25% here. This happened here. This happened here. So what they do is that they dispatch or they have officers patrol certain areas because they're high crime areas. Therefore, like for where I'm at, probably one of the deadliest, not one of the deadliest spots in the city, but in our precinct, there's a lot of shootings there. And unfortunately, there's a lot of homicides there. So they always want us to be there to deter it as much as we possibly can, those homicides and shootings, and also robberies as well too. So that police officer presence really deters people from doing stuff. They almost never do it in front of us. They got to be really stupid to do that. That's how we interact with the public.
Yeah, unfortunately, in those high crime areas, that's where the voice is the loudest. This boogeyman idea of this angry, entitled white police officer mowing down young black men. And so because of this, let's defund the police. Unfortunately, that voice is loudest in those high crime areas and high crime neighborhoods. What do you think it would look like in these neighborhoods, in our country in general, if we were to defund the police?
We're already kind of seeing that right now. Minneapolis, where their carjackings went up by 200%.
Wow.
They completely, they went up by 200%. And carjackings, I've seen it through like witness footage and everything. It's a very, very violent thing, a very grim thing. And sometimes I'm going to stop because I don't like watching it. It's very, very ugly stuff that they do to the victims. And it breaks my heart for the victims that experience this and everything. But defunding the police or just straight out dismantling it, before thinking of why we're going to do this or why that fence was put there, as I keep on putting out in this podcast, they're just doing this for like through the emotional argument. They're doing it as a knee jerk. And to me, it's like you are going to see a jump in crime. New York City was actually relatively safe because of the CompStat that they were able to do and because they had a huge amount of manpower so they can have officers who are on foot, not only engage with the community, but also that officer presence that deters the criminals from doing wrong.
Right.
Now that that's happening, you have police officers that want to what we call lateral move, to go to a different jurisdiction for other reasons. They may move there. There's better opportunities, so and so. Like all the cops are doing that now. Like everybody, the morale, unfortunately, is at its lowest point. I thought it was low before. It is nowhere near low.
Oh, wow. It's
low everywhere. And it's unfortunate because I just pray to God, like I want to be optimistic. I want to keep that hope. This will swing back and this will improve things for the better, but it's going to get harder before it gets worse. And you will see an increase of crime. And so much so in Minneapolis, where they had so much crime going on, the call volume was so high that the city council were wondering, like, hey, what's going on here? There's so much crime. People, my constituents, my voters are saying, like, where's the police? They dismantled it within a month without even any type of strategic outlook, no strategic plan to reform the police or anything. Now, I understand if you have to dismantle it and rebuild it from the bottom up, if the entire department is completely corrupt. They did that, I think, in Camden, New Jersey, or some other city, if I'm not mistaken. The entire, including the chief, they were all corrupt. So they had to completely dismantle the police department and build it from the ground up. That I would be for, but for a lot of these cities that are doing this, they're getting rid of budgets, they're getting rid of, like, reducing manpower. And in many ways, defunding the police, you actually are paying the officers more money because you have to pay them overtime. In my police department, we've been suffering our riots 5 years ago to where our attrition rate was so high. Now we're 600 officers short.
Oh, wow.
In patrol alone is 600 officers short, to where the stress would just take forever. The call volume, especially during the summertime, gets absolutely insane, to where you're just bouncing from call to call to call, depending on what that is. It may not be that bad, but regardless, you are consistently working. And then if the other shift is short, they have to, what we call drafting, you have to stay over for 4 hours. So if someone's getting paid, for example, $25 an hour, you have to pay the officer a time and a half. So now he's making roughly $35 an hour. And that adds up. That's not including people who got 20 years on, who's got like 10 years on or whatever, who's making maybe $1 a minute, like $125 an hour, or like $1 a second or something like that. A lot of people don't seem to realize that the defunding actually costs a lot more money. And you have to have enough manpower to keep that overtime down.
You know, the funny thing is, I know in Los Angeles that they were calling for defunding the police. Then I heard that there was this, I think it's like in the Beverly Hills area, where they actually created this like private police kind of thing that actually have arrest powers. So basically remove the protection for the people that are not as wealthy, while the wealthy people are creating their own security. And I think that's what's basically going to happen with this defund the police thing. And Black Lives Matter made it clear that that's what they're calling for. A lot of these politicians are agreeing with it because they feel like that's where their bread is buttered. If we don't agree with this thing, then we're not going to be reelected. But unlike, they throw common sense out the window. I don't think we should defund the police. I think we should fund the police, fund them for better training, fund them for better whatever they need. I'm not saying that there are not any issues at all. I'm sure we have highlighted some of the issues in this podcast, but I do think that we can train them better to do a lot of things better than just say, hey, let's take money from them or just dismantle it.
Yeah, and one thing that you mentioned, like with like a private security force or private police, for lack of a better term, where I work at is like a relatively nice area. I do patrol the projects in this precinct in my part of the city. And one of the weirdest things was like, I'd never seen a defund the police sign in the projects. I've never seen that. I may seen, Black Lives Matter and all that kind of stuff. I'm not offended by that, but I never seen defund the police in those projects. The defund the police was incredibly popular nearby the fancy parks, nearby the restaurants, nearby where all of our like people who come from the county, from like outside of the city, they come in. All of those places had defund the police plastered the signs all over their houses. And I'm like, okay, that's fine and all. But at the same time, it was kind of weird. It was like, for me, when I saw this, it was just so weird because of course you guys would say that because you guys hardly call us. Or like when you do call us, it's like something severe, like carjackings or robberies or something like that. But once those carjacking robberies happened, all those signs started disappearing in the nicer areas. And part of my beat is also a really nice area where they got like very 5-star hotels. They got very nice hotels and everything. They hired their own security force, and they have like unarmed and armed guards, not only in the hotels, but also walking around on the streets, which is nice because we don't have enough manpower to cover these areas. But it's also kind of just showing you the wealth disparity of what these poor communities will suffer if you take funding or you just completely dismantle the police force for these like poor areas. And I was actually with a partner of mine during the summer, shortly after the George Floyd incident and after our protests, and we were talking to some of the folks in one of our projects, and he's been on for about 9 years. Everybody kind of knows him, but the folks there, they were just drinking beer and everything, and they said, defund the police, we don't understand. Like, we need our police. If anything, we need more. Like, we need more cops. And granted, this is anecdotal, but they were telling us that. Like, we need more of you guys. And yes, we want to perform, but we need more police officers here. There's just not enough of you guys. And actually, in the Cato Institute, I think it's the Cato Institute, amongst the projects in the Black community, a majority of them, I think about 60 to 80%, you may have to look this up, but 60 to 80% said that they had the same amount or they wanted more police officers, not the other way around. And that just kind of shows you the kind of cognitive dissonance of what these politicians are doing. I think you guys are doing something completely wrong here. Like, you guys, if you want to change this, which I'm for, you have to guide this in the right way. Otherwise, it's just going to make it worse for everybody.
All right, Officer CigarBro, we have been going for a little bit, but I want to give you opportunity to share some real life stories of police officers doing good. After that, just share your heart with the people. Share your heart with the listeners. As a police officer, what is your heart? What do you like to see happen?
So for the police officers, some stories doing good. There's a lot of, of course, the typical, like, handing out gift card, handing out food and stuff like that. I actually had a case where a truck drunk driver, and he ran over bicyclists. And I was the first one to get there. They actually got the tag and everything, and I was trying to get camera footage and everything like that. A detective actually helped me out, and he took me under his wing to help solve this case. Those people that actually got hit, some of them were wearing not necessarily Black Lives Matter material, but they were wearing, like, I think one of them said, like, racism and it's a pandemic, or like support Black-owned businesses. And so, sure, they had some type of viewpoint that may be antagonistic to police, but they were willing to help me. I was incredibly thankful that they were willing to trust us to do the work. And eventually we got a warrant for this dude's arrest because we needed them to do something called like a photo array or something like that in order to get the warrant, in order to visually identify the person who committed the crime. And I was completely grateful for that. And they also, he was a young dude. He said, I want to thank you so much for helping getting this guy so much. He was actually trying to defend, like, on social media, it went everywhere. And he was trying to defend me. It's like, hey, dude, it was only one cop. He was only there for 10 minutes. He was trying to do his best. And guess what? He got the warrant and everything. So I want to thank you for that and all that. So that was one of the good stories. But for the public, to me as an officer, I try to be a man of God and everything. for you, the public, I'm going to try to do the best that I can. There's not a lot of things I can do, like the qualified immunity or anything, but the number one thing that I can do is do my job and do it well. All I ask really is to try to wait until the facts come out, maybe a couple months, but hopefully that is enough. And I will try to do my best to not only do my job well, but also try to, intervene in these situations and everything. That is my profession.
The purpose of this podcast and the reason why we've named it Removing Barriers is because we're trying to remove barriers so that we can have a clear view of the cross. And you might be wondering, how does a conversation about police and policing accomplish this? Well, we're currently living in a terribly volatile and anxiety-ridden time. And that's not to say that we're the first to go through it, not by any stretch of the imagination, but we want people to understand that the enemy of our souls is seeking to make good use of a crisis and inflame tensions, make enemies of the wrong groups of people, turn us against each other, turn us against the wrong groups of people, encourage rebellion, and create an environment where hatred, fear, anger, and rebellion thrive. And in that kind of environment, the root issues never get discussed. They never get resolved. But Jesus Christ came to bring an end to all of that. He came to address the root issues from which all of these things that we're talking about are flourishing from. He came to put an end to that root issue. And John 10:10 says this. This is Jesus talking. He says, "The thief cometh not, but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly." And then when we go down and we read in John 6:38, he says, "For I came down from heaven, not to do mine will, but the will of him that sent me. And this is the Father's will which hath sent me, that of all which he hath given me I should lose nothing, but I should raise it up again at the last day. And this is the will of him that sent me, that every one which seeth the Son, and believeth on him, may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day." Verse 47, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that believeth on me hath everlasting life. I am that bread of life." Jesus Christ makes that promise, not just to the people he was talking to at that time when those words were recorded, but here for us today. The reason why we are seeing such animosity, such turmoil, such anxiety, such tension, such hatred, such all of these terrible things, fill in the blanks, is because at the very heart, we are sinners. We are separated from God by our sins, and we were born in sin. And because we're born in sin, everything that we do is tainted by that sin, including our relationships with one another. And when we say that in this podcast we're hoping to remove barriers, we want to show you what God's way of dealing with the issues are, right? We have Officer CigarBro, who very graciously agreed to come and talk to us about this issue, to give us a different perspective on the policing issue, on dealing with people, on seeing the entire situation before you pass judgment. Passing judgment before you know what's going on is a sin. Pointing fingers and making enemies out of people who are not the enemy is sin. And he shared his heart with the people, and he said, hey, before you jump to conclusions, before you jump to defunding, before you jump to make us your enemy, give it a few months to let the information come out. And that's something that we can all agree to do in trying to reconcile this schism, this rift between authority and the people. And let's get this straight. Authority is from God. Look at what the Bible says in Daniel chapter 2, verse 21. And this is interesting because Daniel was a slave in a foreign land, and he was subject unto the authorities above him. And he was talking to the king, and he says to the king that God is the one who changes the times and changes the seasons. He removes kings and he sets up kings. He gives wisdom, he takes away wisdom. This is coming from Daniel, who was not in the most perfect situation. If you know his story, he was under captivity, and he said those things. Even in captivity, Daniel understood that God is sovereign in all of these different things, even in who's in charge. So this idea that we can somehow rebel against authority, even if it comes in the form of a police officer, is ungodly. It is a rebellion actually not just against the police officer, but against God himself. And look at what Jesus said in John chapter 19. Jesus, who came down from heaven, he is the God of the universe, came down from heaven and was subject to all of the authorities, not just to his parents, but also to the authorities of his time. And this is what he said to Pontius Pilate when Pilate threatened to execute him. Jesus answered in verse 11 and said, "Thou couldst not have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore, he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." And so God himself in the flesh, who is Jesus Christ, submitted himself to authority because he knows that there is no authority that's in place except God put it there. And so if you're listening to this podcast and you might be legitimately hurt and confused and offended by what you perceive police officers are doing, you might feel some kind of way. And I'm not discounting what you may feel. But what I'm saying to you is when you rebel against authority, you are ultimately rebelling against God who installed that authority. And you may be saying, well, I don't have to submit to them because they're no good and they've did this, that, or the other, this, that, and the third. But wait a minute. God says in 1 Peter 2 and in verse 13, submit yourself to the authorities for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And so it's the will of God to submit. You know what else is the will of God? The will of God for you, if you're listening to this podcast, is to be changed at the very root, is to be changed at the heart. You must be changed at the heart. Otherwise, these problems that we're talking about will continue to ferment. They will continue to grow. They will continue to exacerbate. We will continue to interact with each other with distrust and hate and anger and revenge and rebellion, all of these things that serve to make the situation worse. But Jesus came, remember, he said he came that we might have life and have it more abundantly. He came to undo what the enemy of our souls is trying to do in fostering that rebellion and that hate and all of that sort of thing. And so in order to have a new heart, you must turn your eyes onto yourself and realize that you are a sinner every bit as much as the person that you're pointing at. You are a sinner as well, and you have to answer to God for your sins. Now, God is holy and perfect, and he absolutely will hold you accountable for your sins. He must, because he is love, but he is also just. And so what will you say to God about your sins? Are you going to say that your sins were not that bad? Are you going to say to the judge of the universe, whose standard is perfection, that your lack of perfection is not that bad? My friend, you can't stand before God with your sins as they are, because you will not be acquitted. You will not be found innocent. You will be found guilty and sent to hell for the sins that you've committed against a holy God. That's who you're sinning against. That rebellion that you feel toward police officers, that rebellion, that anger that you feel toward, that's not towards police officers. That's actually ultimately against God. And so what we're pleading with you today, if you're listening to this podcast, is to consider what this situation is actually teaching us. The heart of man is wicked. That includes your heart. And we appeal to you, we entreat you to look to the Savior. He came down from heaven in order to take the punishment of your sin, and he put it on himself, And he has promised that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And not only that, he will give you a new heart. He will give you new desires. He will make you a brand new creature that seeks to make everything genuinely right at the root, not just with social programs and leftist agenda and rebellion. No, you're going to be changed at the heart, at the root. Jesus is the answer. The Bible says in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, that for by grace are you saved through faith. It's not of yourselves. It's a gift of God. It's not of your works, because if it were, we would have reason to boast. But God was gracious to send Jesus to die for our sins because he knows that we can't justify ourselves. We can't save ourselves. And so I encourage you, if you're listening to this podcast, if you were listening to anything that Officer CigarBro was saying, if you were listening to what MCG is saying, this idea of submitting to authority ultimately goes back to you as a human being submitting to God. God instilled that authority. And listen, God is not blind. He sees that 10% that we were talking about, the 10% that ruin it for everyone. Do not think for a minute that those 10% will not stand before God and answer for their misdeeds. Do not think that any evil on this planet that has occurred will go unanswered before a holy God. He will hold them accountable, and he will eradicate that sin. He sent his only son to die for the sole purpose of eradicating that sin. Don't think that anybody that's sinning against you or against him will walk away unscathed. In fact, if we look at the scriptures in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 8, if thou seest the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth it, and there be higher than they. What's that saying? Don't fret yourself over any type of injustice that you see, whether it's coming from the 10% of police officers or whether it's coming from anyone else, whether it's coming from the highers that be, because one that is higher than they, that is God, he sees it, he regards it, and he will hold them accountable. Trust in that. Believe in that, and believe that when Jesus says that he will wash you and make you clean, if you turn from your sins and believe on him, that he will do that. And he has also promised to eradicate sin from this earth. Believe that. He has promised he will do it, and he will do it. God cannot lie. So that's our heart and our purpose in this podcast, is to not only show the other side of the story, as it were, by bringing a police officer so that they can really explain their side, but also to compel you to consider the ultimate authority, which is the Lord Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, as revealed through the scriptures.
Officer CigarBro, thank you for joining us on the Removing Barriers podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure to be on.
Thank you for listening. To get a hold of us or to support this podcast, go to anchor.fm/removing barriers. This has been the Removing Barriers podcast. We attempted to remove barriers so that we all can have a clear view of the cross.